I was watching a Neil Oliver video. He was doing a programme about what's going on in Syria, and he was interviewing a chap described as a Middle East analyst. At least that's how he described himself. Of course, anyone can have an opinion about what caused the fall of Assad and laid the groundwork for the subsequent blood-soaked upheaval that is Syria today. And that analyst had his opinion, has his opinion, and is entitled to it. But I should think that most of you who know my style by now will realise that I have my doubts about his opinion. In fact, I think he was talking the most arrant nonsense. He does have a most magnificent beard though, and for some reason people are impressed by beards, so I thought I'd give his ideas a bit of an airing. I'm glad to say that I don't have the same impressive topiary, but I hope that you might see the logic in my argument nonetheless. I'm Granniopteryx. I'm on YouTube, Rumble, BitChute and Minds. So, this guest was saying that Assad fell because of a conspiracy between Turkey and Israel, who wanted the balkanization of the local Arab countries. I can imagine that Turkey would, because that's how the Ottoman Empire controlled its empire, but I can't believe that a sane Israel would want a lot of little uncontrollable jihadist enclaves along their borders. Surely Hamas in Gaza is as good an example as any of what happens when a local area is taken over by a bunch of murderous gangsters using the promise of paradise to provide cannon fodder for their ambitions. The guest also said that Turkey and Israel wanted to destroy he implied the civilization of the borders which had been agreed by the British and the French in the early 20th century. Just to recap, after the First World War, there was a huge swathe of land across the Middle East which had been the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire went in on the side of the Germans, you will remember, in World War I, and they lost. To the victors, the spoils, as they say. And the British Empire and the French were the victors. And they came to an agreement about divvying up chunks of the Ottoman Empire into areas over which they would take influence. And this is known to history as the Sykes-Picot Treaty. Sykes and Picot drew lines on a map, straight lines for the most part, creating countries which had previously not existed as independent states: Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, later on the Kingdom of Transjordan. They hadn't been states before, but the form they were given would be recognisable to the Europeans who were making those maps. Neil Oliver's guest was mourning the breakdown of these countries with the straight lines, and with some justification. But he was completely ignoring the simple fact that these borders were entirely artificial and completely ignored tribal differences in the area. The borders cut straight through cultural areas, linguistic areas, religious areas. It wasn't just a uniform linguistic monolith that people nowadays seem to imagine it was. It was more diverse in the proper sense than Europe is today. I don't know whether Sykes and Picot were chopping up these areas deliberately to create internal divisions so that those countries would be weakened by that. That's a common theory, and it does have some validity. But then we can also imagine that they assumed that things would pan out in the same way that in Europe you can have Catholics on one side of a border and Catholics on the other side of a border. And you don't expect them to declare war on their Lutheran compatriots in the same country. We did away with that in the 17th century, didn't we? The only problem is that the Ottoman Empire was sort of pickled into the 15th century. Anyway, many think it was a deliberate plot, but it could just as easily have been simple ignorance. Whatever. What Oliver's guest is completely ignoring is that just because Mr. Sykes and Monsieur Picot thought that a straight line through the desert made a country, that doesn't mean to say that the area they were dividing up was not already Balkanized. You see, the way the Ottoman Empire ran itself was like this. It was a patchwork of different religions, languages and ethnicities. And so long as the people there paid their taxes to the empire didn't give a stuff about their beliefs or practices. So long as those beliefs and practices stayed in the village. And that's the important thing. And so long as the general consensus that everyone agreed broadly that the entire institution was sort of Muslim in general. And that's why the Yazidis survived for so long. The Yazidis technically should not be still around. They're not Muslims and they're not Christians or Jews, and those were the two religions that are supposed to be tolerated by Islam. But as long as the Yazidis stayed in their mountain villages, the Ottoman Empire left them alone. And that's how the area was before Sykes-Picot. It was already Balkanized. What's happening now isn't something unpredictable. What's going to happen, and I was making videos about this literally years ago, is that there'll be a lot of mini-states, as there was before, but this time they'll be independent rather than under an imperial umbrella, unless, of course, Turkey goes in and tries to re-establish its own historical Ottoman Empire. The problem at present is that Christians, Druze, Alawites and Yazidis are all unarmed. They were always among the more peaceable. You could say in the case of the Alawites and the Christians, the more civilized and Europeanized of the Syrians. And so they're less likely to be fighters, and this will, of course, have to change. They'll start forming militias to protect themselves. Of course, the arms dealers are going to make a mint out of this, and I can imagine they're already salivating over their spreadsheets. But anyway, that's going to take a bit of time. Meanwhile, so far as I can assess, and of course, I don't have access to any more documentation than any of you, what's going on isn't so much a plot as a violent redrawing of imposed borders that should never have been imposed in the first place. Sykes-Picot, whether by accident or design, was a forced and unnatural marriage of people who could never have got along philosophically or morally to start with. Europeans often seem to think that they're all the same out there in the Middle East, but they're not, they never were. They had and still have cultures as different from each other as different as someone born and brought up in an English village and educated in the Anglican tradition, being told that diversity is our strength when a lot of men from the highlands of Somalia, brought up in the Muslim tradition, turn up in a local hotel. And that's why Mr. Oliver's guest is so dangerous. He is sort of loading the blame on Israeli plots as if that's the only reason for the chaos in Syria, but it isn't. The reason for the chaos in the whole Middle East is that it's populated by a lot of, not people, but peoples. By a lot of peoples. Peoples who've completely different views on how life should be lived. And these peoples were forced by a bunch of politicians to pretend they could make common cause with each other. And that's a lesson for us here in this country. And I wish that Mr. Oliver and his guest would give that issue more attention than talking about Israeli plots, because that is looking completely in the wrong direction. Okay, till next time. You can help my channel by subscribing and clicking the notification bell. That's quite important. And by sharing if you're so inclined. Links to my other channels and to donation methods are in the description. But the best way you can help is simply by clicking like and notify. Thank you.